This is a Math 1 lesson summary video for the task titled Relative Frequency. This is a solidify and practice understanding task. The purpose of this lesson is for students to use context to interpret and write conditional statements using relative frequency tables. So in this task, Rachel is still thinking about the number of text messages that she sends, and she wants to convince her mom that she doesn't send an excessive amount of text for a teenager. So she organizes her data into a two-way table, and she organizes the table by adults versus teenagers and how many of those adults and teenagers send more than or less than 100 texts per day. So here is her data in her table. So she has 24 teenagers and 24 adults. Of those 24 teenagers, 20 of them send on average more than 100 texts per day, and 4 send on average less than 100 texts per day. For the adults, 2 of them on average send more than 100 texts per day, and 22 of the adults send on average less than 100 texts per day. So she has a total of 22 people from her survey that have an average of more than 100 texts per day, and 26 that have an average of less than 100 texts per day. So then she started doing some calculations. These are called relative frequency tables, and you can organize them by row, column, or relative frequency table for all of the data. So how it works is here we're just isolating, just looking at the teenagers, and then just looking at the adults, and then just looking at people in general without considering whether or not they were teenagers or adults. So of the teenagers, so this is a relative frequency by row because we're only looking at a row. So if 20 out of the 24 teenagers send on average more than 100 texts per day, that is 83.3% of teenagers from her study send more than 100 texts per day. That means that only 16.7% of the teenagers from her study send less than 100 texts per day. So she can tell her mom that of the teenagers, 83.3% of us are sending on average more than 100 texts per day. Then if you come down here, we want to just look at a relative frequency table by column. That means we're just looking at the people that send more than 100 texts per day. We're ignoring the rest of this. So this tells us that 20 of the 22 people that send more than 100 texts per day are teenagers from her study here. So 91% of those that are sending more than 100 texts per day are teenagers, according to her data. And then we have a relative frequency whole table. So the 100% is taken here. So what this tells us is out of everybody surveyed, 42% of the people surveyed were teenagers and they send more than 100 texts per day. All right, that's it for this video. Thank you for watching.